So welcome back to part 2 of breaking constraints and posing constraints. So this is a picture of Boltzmann's tombstone, and it has a very short summary, which is that he succumbed to entropy. So that's the equation for entropy, K log W. Very simple. But basically, we have the log of all of the thermodynamic states. So it's a very simple equation. We return now to a lot of this idea of temporal information. And we talked about Markovian systems at the end of the last lecture, where we have this temporal memory, where we need to know if things are happening, we can remember things in the past, or if there's a dependence on past state. So in Landauer's principles, we'll recall there was no explicit temporal information. All Landauer asked was, can you erase a bit of information, and how much energy does it take? He didn't ask, if you keep erasing bits, how much energy does it take to maintain that behavior? Or, if we want to have something like Maxwell's demon, where we need to erase things or prevent things from happening, can we do that without, how much energy does it take? Or can we, conserve energy by, finding patterns that allow us to do that efficiently, or what? We don't ask that question. All Landauer asked was about a static system, and that was it. Now, when we talk about Shannon entropy, or with H, temporal information is implicit. So a lot of times we'll look at a probability distribution of H. So it might be a probability of I in all events. Sometimes those events happen in time. Sometimes it's not a spatial array, sometimes it's an array in time. And so the temporal aspect is implicit in Shannon entropy, although again, it's not explicit. There's no term for temporal diversity. There's no term for like a temporal memory. It's just that, you have these things that may occur over time. And so that's where we have H. So we have an example here of a probability distribution. We have clumps of these different agents in different amounts. So we have 4 agents, 2 agents, 1 agent, and we can calculate the information of that ensemble accordingly. Now S, which is our thermodynamic probability, and this is not what Landauer talked about, but this is, of course, what Boltzmann talked about. This is configurational. It's not combinatorial. So H, for example, is combinatorial in the sense that we can reconfigure these ensembles in different ways. Thermodynamic probabilities, however, are configurational. So they don't rely on the ensemble in the conventional sense. They rely on the sort of the configuration of things. So here you see these agents with their eye view, their viewfinders pointing in different directions. And so that would be the configuration that we would want to capture. And the idea would be that maybe all of their viewfinders are aligned in the same direction, but then over time they become turned and you don't have them all in the same direction anymore. And so that would be thermodynamic entropy, although that's not a very good example of it. But anyways, that's the difference between H and S. And so I take this quote from John Wheeler's from BIT, which is from 1989. This is where they also talked about the sort of the interplay between informational entropy and thermodynamic entropy. And the quote is, all things physical are information theoretic in origin. And this is a participatory universe. Observer participancy gives rise to information. So what does that mean? That means that you have something that's physical, like thermodynamic probability, but it relies on information, and it relies specifically on observer-participant dynamics. So it relies on the observer. And this is, of course, an idea from quantum physics, but I guess it applies to this too, that, again, depending on the observer, depending on how they sort of interpret these things, and not just the measurements, but sort of the state of reality. So we're not going to get too much into that, but basically the idea is that if you take thermodynamic entropy and you measure it, there is this implicit informational component. And sometimes there's also an explicit informational component, and that's really dependent on observer participancy, so interacting with what you're doing. So this is something maybe, if we want to come back to this, it's fine, but I don't really have any more to say about it. we can make the link more explicit between thermodynamic entropy and Shannon information through something called Gibbs entropy. So Gibbs entropy is the amount of Shannon information, H, needed to define the microscopic state of the system. So this could be a thermal trend, which is a gain in entropy corresponding to a loss of information, or a gain in information that corresponds to a loss of entropy. And people have developed this in different ways. Bernoulli talked about neg entropy, and Szilard had his engine, and so we see this in different contexts. Neg entropy is the difference between Gaussian or maximum entropy and observed distributions, which are described by the moments of the distribution. So we can actually have this, this idealized distribution versus an observed distribution, and that's what we call neg entropy. This is equivalent to Kullback-Leibler divergence, if you're familiar with that. And, that's another thing that is, there's a whole literature on this. I just wanted to make people aware of these things in the literature. We talked about some of these in the last lecture, but I wanted to reinforce it here. So this is an example of a system where we have a persistent state that goes across, and we have a coin flip. And we're going to flip our coin 4 times, and we're going to look at the maximum amount of information we can have. So this is where we have a system where we have a persistent 2-state system, a coin. We're going to flip the coin 4 times. And when we flip the coin, every time we flip the coin, we're going to gain information content or information capacity so that the total information is 2.0. So we have here, since we have a persistent state, we don't really have a variation at any one time in terms of what our information is. We flip our coin. It can either be heads or tails. The probability is more or less random, so it's a H value of 0.5. So heads is equally likely as tails. So we have maximal information. I mean, we don't have any, we can't say for sure whether it's heads or tails. And so we have maximal information. It's in a maximal information state. So this is how you calculate that. And then over time, you gain 0.5 H value at every iteration. So we continue this out 4 times. We flip the coin 4 times, and we end up at, and the flips are, of course, non-dependent. So if the flips are dependent, this would be different. But since they're independent events, our H max equals 2.0. So this is our model here of sort of how we gain information by having these independent events, by having these persistent states, and showing what that looks like. This article from Altenaer from 2017, this is non-equilibrium thermodynamics in information theory. So we can go back to non-equilibrium thermodynamics. So we were talking about in some of the earlier examples, equilibrium thermodynamics, closed systems. This is where we have non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which we talked about in the last lecture, and then linking that to information theory. So this paper covers basic concepts in relaxing dynamics. This is from Journal of Physics A. And so this relates to the model I just showed, in that you have uncertainty as they define it, being a single, being consisting of single yes-no questions as bits of information. So in this case, we have a bit of information. It's a flip between 0 and 1, or heads or tails. Each one is equally probable, so it's an information of 0.5. If we have a system of yes-no questions, each yes-no response has an information of 0.5 unless we know someone's going to say yes, or we know someone's going to say no, in which case the maximum information is 1.0 because we know what the answer is. Or it could be 0.0 since we also know what the answer is and there's no information at all. This is where it gets a little tricky because it depends on how you define it. So the mean number of questions needed to be answered in order to identify something unambiguously. So we need to have a mean number of questions that can be answered to identify something unambiguously. So we're maybe defining an object and we're asking questions about that object. We're querying the object in different ways. And we have to construct these answers so that the yes-no responses can describe it minimally. So we don't want to ask too many questions about it. We don't want to have redundant questions. We just want enough questions and enough yes-no responses to identify the thing as simply as possible. And so we have to take the mean number of questions needed. And so this can be calculated as this U parameter uncertainty. And so the idea behind this is that basically the greater number of the questions that you need to ask, the greater the uncertainty. Because if I had, say for example, a cube in front of me, I might be able to describe the cube pretty completely and ask people questions, maybe in 2 questions. That would result in me understanding that it's a cube. And so that would be a very simple way to do it. And of course, it depends on how efficient the questions are. But the idea here is that given this sort of a consistent, efficiency, if you have a phenomenon that's ambiguous, say something people don't know how to define, or a very complex system versus a cube, you would need to ask more questions, more yes-no questions. So the idea is that they're informational bits doing work, and that they're basically answering these yes-no questions, and they're defining some physical state or some informational state, and then you need more bits basically to define that system. And so uncertainty is defined as the summation of Q times log 2Q. So the questions times the log 2 questions. So it's basically information theory in the form of questions, and then the sum of those questions, and you're treating it as an ensemble, and you're getting uncertainty. So it's a very direct application of Shannon's equation. So then there are these strongly relaxing dynamics. At any time, information about the system microstate is discarded, so that you can discard the system's microstate. You don't have that as a memory component, and you basically can ask a bunch of questions, forget them, and then kind of move forward, maybe summarize them, and then use that summary plus the new questions to describe the system. So there are different ways you can do this. This is satisfied by any Markovian dynamics converging to a unique steady state constructed from a physical equilibrium potential. So these are non-equilibrium steady states. And then the irreversible convergence of a statistical ensemble towards maximum non-committal probability distribution is compatible with thermodynamic equilibrium. So this is where we have this statistical ensemble that is compatible with thermodynamic equilibrium. Basically, the informational description of the thing is compatible with an equilibrium in thermodynamic equilibrium. So you don't have like these, you basically can have a closed informational system. And so this is another diagram I did, calculating out sort of the evolution of this system that I showed you earlier of the coin flips. So this is where we start at an initial condition, and we move around this two-dimensional phase diagram. We have H, which is our information content at any one time, versus H max. So as we move over time, we have this maximum value. We kind of move around. We actually introduce a new term here called redundancy. So we take this phase diagram, I put A, B, C, and D on this diagram. And this is what we have over in the calculations column. This is S equals 1, S equals 1, S equals 4, S equals 3. This is just kind of from the initial states. And then this calculates the redundancies. The idea here is that if we're in this space, if we have a maximum H, we have S equals 1 at chance, B is S equals 1 persistent state, C is S equals 4 low information, S equals 3 is at chance with a maximum H. So basically we have low and high information, we have a low and high H max. And we can calculate the redundancy for each of these. And so we calculate the redundancy, which is defined as the amount of wasted space or slack in the information channel. So the example I gave before, the one that was hand-drawn, that's where we had no wasted space in the information channel. But redundancy can be, it can be additional information. It could be like, like we saw with the examples of the systems that had more states than the thing was trying to control. We can have redundant states. We can have redundant information in there. And we can view that in two ways. We can view redundancy as being a positive thing. In other words, redundancy can allow us to back up our intuitions. If we have more informational states of the same type, we can assume that those are probably the right answer, or a good candidate for an answer. Or we can view it as wasted space, which means that we can view it as like something we want to get rid of. And so, in communications channels, oftentimes redundancy is bad, but sometimes, in some cases, redundancy can be good. But nevertheless, we can calculate redundancy from information. This is an example of where we have a comparison of H for information entropy and S thermodynamic entropy. When we have low information and low entropy, a system is noisy and efficient. When we have high information and high entropy, there's information richness, but the system is disordered. When we have low information and high entropy, the system is noisy and disordered. And then high information and high entropy is where we have information richness and high consumption of the system. So basically we have information richness versus noise, and we have disordered systems versus efficient systems and systems that consume a lot of energy. So they're basically they're ordered, but they're ordered in different ways, towards efficiency or towards high consumption. High consumption relates to redundancy, so you're consuming a lot of energy. It's not efficient. You have a lot of redundancy, and that's where you have high information and high entropy. So redundancy can play a role in maximizing both information and entropy. This other paper by Procaccia and Levine from 1976, this is on potential work. These are the connections between thermodynamics and probability. This is from the Journal of Chemical Physics. So statistical mechanics is defined as work, or W, and that provides a distribution of disequilibrium states. So work is where we've done work, we've used energy, it's now this bond energy, and it's in a disequilibrium state. A system is defined by W max, and we saw W max, or we saw H max, which is similar to W max. H max was the maximum amount of information. W max is the maximum amount of work. Then W itself is related or equal to H init. And H init is the informational content of the initial state. So we start with a single state. It has an information content that represents our work, which is the distribution of disequilibrium states. So, and our system is a W max. So our system is a set of H inits. So our system is a set of initial states with information content. As W is performed, or as work is performed, it is converted to entropy. As we know, work converts free energy into bond energy. So as W progresses, because this is a time series, then we convert things to entropy. Now, in this scenario, H, which is information, is likewise degraded by work, and a process is irreversible. So when we do work, we not only create or convert free energy to entropy or bond energy, but we also take the informational content and we degrade it with work. So it's interesting that, we could take, like, say, for example, a coin flip, and we flip it. We put work into flipping the coin. And before we flip the coin, we don't know what the state is going to be. It could be heads, it could be tails, and our information calculation of H equals 0.5 reflects that. We don't know which state it's going to be in. It could be in either state at an equal probability. But when we put work into it, when we expend work, we flip the coin and it lands on the ground, then we have a state. The state is unlocked, and that state is the state. So if it's heads, then we know that the information is heads. That's the information. It's not tails for that point in time. So as work is performed, H is degraded by W. H becomes 0, goes to 0 because there's no information anymore. The information is removed. The information is erased, I guess, would be the way to put it. And that's an irreversible process. We can't unflip the coin and say we don't know what the state is going to be. We can flip the coin again, but that's not the same thing. If we have a memory, we can, lock in an information state for any one flip. So we can't just undo the work. We can't undo the information. The final statement they have in this paper is that thermal disequilibrium is more informative as it yields more W and thus more H. So we have thermal equilibrium, we can use that, or thermal disequilibrium, we can use that to yield more work and to yield more entropy, informational entropy that can be degraded later through the application of work. So this is actually an example of an agent with a body and how the body itself insulates the interior. This is an open system where energetic entropy or thermodynamic entropy is fluctuating over time. And this is showing the energy profile per time. This is flux through a membrane. And what we see here at the top is an example of selective energy transfer. So energy is going in and selectively it's controlling the process internally, and the internal entropy is fluctuating from low to high based on how much energy is getting in. Now, the point of this sort of thought experiment is that the agent body acts as an insulator. And so we can see that it acts as an insulator for thermodynamic entropy, for energy coming into the system, but it also leads to disorder. We have heat movement and abundant energies coming in. This gives us disorder, and this can lead to higher entropy and lower information. So, we think about why we have bodies, why we have like cell membranes, things like that. They can actually act as energy insulators, but not just like for regulating thermal aspects of the biology, but also in this general sense of controlling entropy and how it works. This is a paper from Dengso, The Temporal and Effective Structure of Living Systems, a Thermodynamic Perspective. So this kind of puts some flesh on the bones of what I just talked about. So this is a paper from Adaptive Behavior this year, 2023. And the abstract reads, inactive approaches to cognitive science, as well as contemporary accounts of neuroscience, have argued that we need to reconceptualize the role of temporality and affectivity in minds. Far from being limited to special faculties, such as emotional mental states and timekeeping, these accounts argue that time and affect both constitute fundamental aspects of minds and cognition. If this is true, however, how should one conceptualize between the relation of these two fundamental aspects? And so they talk about clarifying the relationship between temporality and affectivity when understood in this fundamental sense. So this talks about inactive notions of self-maintenance with a thermodynamically informed view of the organization of living systems. So inactive notions of self-maintenance rely on information, rely on H. Thermodynamically informed views of organization of living systems relates to H, or it relates to S, or thermodynamic entropy. I will argue that temporality and affectivity should be regarded as two sides of the same coin, that is, two distinct ways of highlighting one and the same process. This process corresponds to the continued differentiation of organism and environment as functional poles of a living system. So this is where you look at both sides of that boundary. You look at what's going on outside the boundary, look at what's going on inside the boundary. The organism is selectively taking in energy, It's regulating the pulsing of energy into the system, and the environment provides the energy, but doesn't provide any of the sort of the transformative power that you might have in an organism. You don't have any of the metabolism, and you don't have any of the processing, information processing that goes on. The temporal and affective structure of living systems may thus be seen as the warp and the weft by which living systems maintain themselves in terms of thermodynamic non-equilibrium. Now, in this paper, he talks about affect in a way that's not, I don't know if that's necessarily relevant to informational entropy, but it's, that's information processing by an agent, so we can talk about that. And then there's this aspect of temporality, of course, which is important for how these things are temporally regulated. So that's all I have for this section. I hope you learned something, and we'll move on to part 3 in another video.